Hello, and welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show. My name is Natalie, and I am based in beautiful Colombia. I really enjoyed this podcast because it gives others the chance to learn more about travel and working abroad in beautiful countries. This podcast also highlights the importance of mindfulness and how travel can give you a whole new perspective on life. In today's episode, we are going to hear from another inspiring guest as they share with us their amazing travel experience. If you are hungry for more episodes from the Global Travel Channel, just head on over to the website at www.globaltravelchannel.com. You can also download the show from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and a host of other locations that are all listed on the Global Travel Channel website. And please, don't forget your friends, family members, and even work colleagues to listen to the show. We really appreciate your support. Okay, on today's show, we are going to meet another amazing traveler. Nbee is the host of Crosspollination, a podcast about creativity and innovation in business. She's an ATCK, which is an adult third culture kid, who grew up on 4 continents and continued to migrate as an adult in geographic and career. She's cross-pollinated work and studies in business, science and policy. She's crossed the Arctic Circle in a canoe, and her most unusual job to date involves investigating the relative sexiness of flies. She is most often found pursuing outdoor sports in weather that makes people ask, why would you want to do that? While nurturing an internal wanderlust.
So it's a very warm welcome to the Global Travel Channel podcast show to Nbee. Nbee, welcome to the show.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're welcome. Now, tell us, whereabouts in the world are you talking to us from today?
So I am talking to you from a very cold Alberta, Canada, just east of the Rockies.
Now, you were just telling me before we got on the show today that I can't even fathom these temperatures that you're talking about, but can you share with my audience what kind of numbers you're talking about there?
Well, I have to say we're having an exceptionally cold snap. It was minus 36 this morning, and it went up to a high of minus 26. The sun is just about setting, so we're going to be going down in temperature again. And, I have to tell you, it's not that bad. People should not be put off coming to Canada, even in the winter, because it's not like this all the time, at least not in all parts of the country.
Well, listen, Megan and Harry are coming, so it can't be that bad.
I think they're coming to the warmer parts. I've noticed that. Wherever they've been, it's a lot warmer.
So what's the talk on, what's the gossip on the street about Harry and Meghan in Canada? Is it even a thing? Are people actually even talking about it? Do they care, or is it something that's quite big in the press over there?
The media has been talking about it, definitely. I don't know how individual Canadians are that excited. I mean, there are definitely royal fans here. There are also the kind of controversy in the media seems to be, well, what if we have to pay for it? What does that mean? What if we have to pay for their security?
Yeah, I saw something yesterday with your Prime Minister saying exactly that, and it seems to me that his kind of intro line about it all was, yeah, we're very happy to have them there, but who's paying for the cost of having them here? And he was very focused on that.
We're always concerned about those kind of numbers.
Yeah.
But they have been offered free coffee for life from the Canadian coffee chain.
Free coffee for life.
That's if that's an attractant, I don't know.
Well, let's hope they're coffee drinkers, because that could be a wasted offer if they're not.
Let's hope so.
Now, with my podcast show, what I normally do for all my guests is I allow you to actually dedicate the show to someone special in your life. So who would you like to dedicate this episode to today?
Oh, well, I was just telling you about the podcasts. And
yes.
I think, I have a couple of podcasts, and I think, it's kind of appropriate to dedicate the show to them, because I have to say they're probably my most committed listeners.
Fantastic. And do they have names, or how do they go by, just other than podcasts?
Cat number 1 and cat number 2, who's permanently resented.
Very simply named. You didn't spend a lot of time coming up with names for them.
They're pretty quiet, low key kind of audience. I'll say that.
Fantastic. Now, I was really excited to get you on the show today, because when we came across each other as a fellow podcaster, I was excited first of all to listen to you talk about your experience with podcasting, because there's a lot of people who listen to my show who are travel bloggers and writers, and they're kind of, just tinkering on the edge of starting a podcast, and they're wanting to get some tips and that. So sometime during the show today, I'm going to ask you a little bit about your podcast journey, but let's get to know you a little bit better first before we start. So travel's been a huge part of your life, and I'm fascinated by this whole concept of adult third culture kid. Can you explain to my audience what that is?
Yeah, and I'm guessing, there's a pretty good chance that there's probably some of those people in your audience as well. If not you yourself, I don't know. So a lot of people are third culture kids. I think probably more and more of us these days, it seems. I don't think I even came across that term until I was, fully an adult and well after kind of that period of childhood travel had passed. But a third culture kid is someone who spent a substantial part of their childhood in a country that is not their home country, and it's not, wherever their parents might be from either. So it's usually, one or more countries that they didn't necessarily have a connection to until they lived there. And some of them, their families moved with the military, some of them with diplomats, some of them, through their jobs, some of them are missionary kids. There's all kinds of different third culture kids. And it seems to be that, a lot of us, having spent, a number of years overseas, that really kind of imprints itself on you. And so when you get to be an ATCK, an adult third culture kid, some of those things are still with you in terms of, how moving and growing up in different places kind of left its mark on you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think you're right. There's a lot of people out there today, specifically in this time and generation, I think, where I guess people are more mobile than they've ever been before, and the whole concept of getting out there and seeing the world and doing it relatively cheaply because it's become more accessible, I guess, as well, has kind of led to those things. When was your first travel experience that you can remember?
My first travel experience was probably when I was about 4, although I think there might have been some vacations about that, but before that, I don't really remember those too clearly. But when I was about 4 years old, my family moved, I'm from Toronto, so I grew up in Toronto, Canada, or mostly anyway. But when I was about 4, my parents moved to the Netherlands. And so, I went to kindergarten there for about a good year and a half. And then there were a couple of other countries after that. We were in Botswana for a while and in Zimbabwe for a while, and then eventually back home to Canada, at least for a while, until I grew up and then I could, take on my own travels.
How old were you by the time you'd got back to Canada again after those trips?
I was about 11, so it was a good 7 years that we were gone. And so that definitely made a difference. And one of the things that a lot of third culture kids often say is that, coming home is the hardest transition, because you sort of expect that, home is the place that you're going to fit in. You feel naturally kind of at home there, and you might realize that you come back and you've missed out on a whole bunch of things. I don't think I knew how to play baseball, or, I'd started skating in the Netherlands, but, typically, a lot of kids, it's winter a lot of the year, learn how to skate here. And so, those are things that I had to kind of pick up again. It
must have been fascinating, though, once you started to be old enough to realise that you were having this experience. What are some of the early memories you had around, meeting kids of different cultures, and particularly language? I think language is something that we cotton onto. Did you have an opportunity to learn Dutch, for instance, when you're in the Netherlands?
Oh, for sure, yeah. And I think, the advantage of moving when you're really young is that you're still kind of at that age when you're able to imprint on languages and learn them really quickly. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be able to pick that up now if I had to go and do the same thing. And I have, lived in countries since I've been an adult where I've had to learn other languages, and it is much, much tougher. So, yeah, I think, when you're that young, you don't necessarily think about it, and you pick it up that quickly. And in most of those countries, I had to learn at least one other language. And the odd thing about it is, if you don't use it after, you kind of lose them. And at some point, a friend of mine who, was a childhood friend during that period, kind of played a recording of us talking. And I can't even understand what I was saying because I've forgotten all of those languages.
Going from the Netherlands to a place like Botswana is a significant change in culture. How did you adapt to that? Was that exciting at the time because you were still so young?
I think so. I think, when you go and you're that young, it's maybe more important to you at that age that, your family is around. And as long as that's kind of in place, it's easier to adapt. I think when you get to be an older kid and you're kind of transitioning at that age, it gets to be harder because then you're kind of, you've got a group of friends. You have more of a life of your own, that kind of thing. And it's definitely tougher at that age. But when you're quite young, I think, a lot of things are sort of a novelty at that stage.
What did you enjoy most about it, that period?
I think I probably enjoyed most actually the period when we lived in Zimbabwe, because that was sort of the longest period. There was a good 3.5 years, and I had friends, I had schoolmates, all that sort of thing, and so I had a chance to kind of establish my own little life at that age, and what I think I missed about it, and it's interesting because I was interviewing a guest on my show recently who said something sort of similar, moving from a warmer country also to Toronto, is that that outdoor life diminished a bit because you're moving from somewhere that's really warm and you spend a lot of time outdoors to somewhere, that's a city, that's an urban life, and it's a little bit different.
Well, I'm just going to have a shout out right now to a good friend who's been on the show before, Dot Becker, who's actually from Zimbabwe, and she came on my show talking about her amazing journey where she actually drove her van from Barcelona down to Zimbabwe and going back home in Africa. So she'll be absolutely thrilled to hear you promoting Zimbabwe as your favourite place.
That's very cool. That sounds like a great trip she did.
She certainly did. Now, you mentioned earlier about, when after you finished that journey and you ended up back in Canada, did you actually want to go home, or did you get the appetite to travel more and want to go other places in the world?
I think, again, at that age, I didn't think too much about it. It was just kind of another move. I think, when I was when I was done high school and I went off to university, and when I was in university especially, I lived in an international residence for a year or so. And so I was, all of a sudden, again, I was with a lot of kids who'd had similar experiences to me. And that kind of reignited that kind of desire to go and see other places and see what's going on in the rest of the world.
When you were that young and you were out there traveling, what did you want to be when you grew up? What was the dream?
All kinds of things. I think when you're that young, it changes every week. I don't know if there was anything that specific at that age, but you could have sold me on just about anything back then.
I was going to say it still is for me. I can wake up any morning and have a new idea on what I want to do in life.
That's fantastic.
It just happens to be podcasting this week. I might go with that, I think.
That's a good plan.
So when did it become a little bit more settled in terms of what you wanted to pursue in terms of education and things when you were back in Canada and exploring that?
I think I knew by the end of high school that I was going to study science, at least initially. By the time I was done with my first degree in science, and that's another interesting story. I think I knew actually maybe a little bit after I'd been working in that area for a while that I wanted to do some other things as well.
What I love about this, and you probably have the same on your show, is when you receive from your guests their bios and you read them and you think, okay, there's so many interesting things here. Which direction can this go? And it was certainly the same when I received yours, and I thought, wow, this is we could talk about specific topics just for an hour without going on to anything else, but. Has that diversity in your life coupled with traveling, has that added another dimension to your life, would you say, at this stage, in terms of all of those things that you're passionate about, whether it be business, science and policy and traveling? Have they all merged together to create you as a different type of person? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. And I think, you can probably speak to this as well, that, it absolutely informs the way that you see things. And what I found when I came home is that, you often see things a little bit differently because you've had experiences in other places that kind of give you a different perspective. I think that helped a lot. I worked in policy in the federal government for a few years. And, we were working on policies that, had implications domestically, but also for, our own policies with respect to, to the international world and to, businesses that are importing things, stuff like that. And so, yeah, it definitely adds to that. I would say also that I think it gives you kind of a little bit more of a basis maybe to connect with other people and to connect with a bigger bigger range of people, because often, you might have been to where they're from or some region nearby. And so, you have some points of contact with a much wider group of people.
Did it make you a more open person by your travel experiences?
Maybe involuntarily, because I don't think you really have a choice when you're traveling, right? There's a lot of adaptation, as I'm sure you and your audience know really well. There's a lot of times when you have to adapt to things. And, sometimes certain places, it's kind of a natural process, and other places it's more challenging, which can be really rewarding as well.
That's an interesting conversation, though, because I just recently had someone on my show who is a self-confessed introvert, and they were telling me about how they remained that way even though they had traveled around the world quite extensively. And I found that quite fascinating, because I'm always someone that thinks, well, okay, the first thing you do when you get off a plane or a transportation solution somewhere is to say hello to somebody in this new place that you're at. But this person was actually the opposite, and because they were a writer or are a writer, they found that locking themselves into their own cocoon to go around and just explore through seeing and smelling and touching, rather than always putting themselves out there to speak to people. I found that quite fascinating, because I'm like you. I think, okay, well, you've got no choice other to interact with people when you travel. But I actually came across somebody that didn't do that.
Oh, wow. That is really interesting. Yeah. And I'd be interesting too to kind of, see the world through, how their eyes, how they see it, because I'm sure it is a different experience.
Now, tell us about when you were working in the government side of things, but because you had that overseas experience, is it easy or difficult to implement ideas that you see around the world as best demonstrated practices within the political framework? Is that something that actually goes on actively, or is it something that is a little bit more difficult to adopt because not so many people have gone and had those particular experiences?
I think it's often a bit of both, and I find that in the business world as well. Because after the government, I sort of transitioned more onto the business side of things, and I absolutely do find that. I think in Canada we're sort of fortunate in the sense that this has become a country where there are people from all over the world, especially in the major cities, and so it's quite common to run into other people who have immigrated here, or they've spent time in a lot of different countries, or they've traveled as well. But absolutely, I think, it can be a bit of both. If you're working on things that have international policy applications, some of that input from outside and different perspectives is really welcome. I think a lot of times, especially if you're working in a department that's relatively open and you're doing something new, there's an opportunity to bring in those new ideas and different perspectives from somewhere else. At other times in different places and, different organizations, the culture may be such that, it's a little more conservative, it's a little more reserved, let's say, and it's tougher to do that, definitely.
So some of the things that you're really passionate about are innovation and in business. And I guess in terms of, I was going down the path of asking that question because I'm really interested to understand, having never worked in a government environment myself before, but worked many years in the corporate world, is it harder to adopt new attitudes within a government framework than it is in a business corporate framework, or vice versa?
Again, I think it probably depends on the organization. I think, when I worked, I had a couple of different rounds in government, one on the sort of research science side of things, and then separately on the policy side. And I would say, in the research side of things were fairly well set up and structured. And so, there wasn't necessarily a lot of innovation in that department, although, research was happening, which is innovative in itself. On the policy side, I think at the first department I worked in, I was really fortunate in that they had decided that they wanted to try a new approach to building out, infrastructure funding, for example. And so they were absolutely highly receptive to doing things differently. And in fact, they had created a bit of a structure where they were purposely doing things differently. But it is quite challenging because it also, government inherently has sort of a hierarchy and a structure around it, and things work the way they work because, they need to remain stable and so on. So yeah, there's a bit of a compromise with that. On the industry side, I think I've seen both. I've seen, organizations that are really really innovative, and again, it depends partly on the structure and the industry, and the culture of the company, often on the leadership and kind of where they are, and sometimes it depends a lot on the challenges they're facing. In the region where I work now, the energy industry is really huge, oil and gas, but that industry has also encountered a lot of challenges in recent years, and so it's starting to look, because it's facing challenges, as to how can we be innovative, how can we do things differently.
I really wanted to get into talking to you about innovation in a lot of different ways today, because I have a lot of people that listen to the show that first of all are business entrepreneurs. They're creative people, they're in the innovation space, they're in the sustainability space, and we're starting to see now this explosion around the world, if I can use that term, in terms of sustainable travel. And is this something that's becoming more apparent to you in Canada? And when you're traveling around the world, are you seeing this as well?
I think we're definitely hearing more about it. I don't know how much, it's a tough thing to answer here, especially because, I'm sure you visited, it's a very large country.
Yeah.
And so, if you're going to get places, you're probably either going to have to drive long distances or take a plane at some point, unless, you have the time to spend weeks and months on the road. So I think here it's a more challenging question to answer, but definitely I know it's being talked about a lot, and people are coming up with some really interesting ideas.
Yeah, they are. And I think it's, I guess we're at that very early stage of the bell curve in terms of where this is going to go. And I was really interested to talk to a friend the other day who attended a huge sustainable travel expo in Singapore, and he told me how it blew his mind away in terms of how far advanced some of the organisations are, and not only talking about sustainable travel, but adopting new technologies to assist with the development of sustainable travel.
For sure. There's some really cool stuff out there. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what emerges in the next few years too.
Now, I've met a lot of Canadians around the world on my travels, but do the Canadians travel a lot domestically? Is there a big tourist industry amongst the Canadian domestic industry?
I think to some degree. I mean, the area where I live now, it's it's pretty much almost adjacent to the national parks. In fact, some of the oldest national parks in the Rockies. And so, when you go there, you meet lots of international tourists, but there's also lots of domestic tourists as well. And also because, there's, less than 10, I would say very large cities in the country, people often move for work, they move for jobs, they move for studies, all of that sort of thing. So yeah, definitely. It's, and I think we all appreciate that it's beautiful. It is cold, but it's beautiful. So there's lots to see.
And unlike your cousins to the south, you haven't decided to build a wall yet to keep everybody out. So you're a very welcoming nation as well, in terms of welcoming people from all over the world.
Well, I think we're thinking that the winters keep things from getting too out of hand, right?
I was going to say it'll be another 4 months before you even decide to go out your front door, won't it?
Yeah, we'll be shoveling our way out.
Fascinating things that you've done, and I wanted to keep talking about your podcast and why you started the podcast, because this gets into this whole cross-pollination, which I when I came across that word that you use for your podcast, I just thought this is absolutely fantastic and it's really, really interesting. So can you tell us the origins of cross-pollination and where that came from?
Oh, well, I'm glad you found it interesting. Yeah, I mean, partly it came from the work that I've been doing over the last few years. I realized, both when I was on the government side, even before that, and then when I was on the industry side of things, I'd spent a lot of time working in things that were related to innovation, whether it was large organizations trying to roll out different programs or do things differently and sort of create products that had, or services that had some new value to whoever was using the services, or whether it was working with startups. There was, lots of innovation going on all around me. And so one of the things that I started the podcast to do was to kind of explore that in different ways. And it's been really fascinating. I've gotten to speak to a lot of cool and really interesting people who are doing all sorts of new things, either within organizations as entrepreneurs, or who own their own businesses and they're doing things on their own as entrepreneurs.
So what's the goal of the podcast? What do you want to achieve from having it?
I think one of the things that I saw a lot when I was working in this area is that often, especially in startups, people would get an idea through cross-pollinating. Essentially, they were taking an idea that came from somewhere else, from some other industry perhaps, or some other part of the world, sometimes even a different time, and they were transplanting it and maybe adapting it to somewhere else to create a solution. And that was the idea behind cross-pollination. And I kind of thought about it, and I also realized that, my own life has been sort of cross-pollinating. I'm not a specialist. I'm not somebody who sort of stayed in the same field for my entire career and become a really deep specialist. And that, for some of us, I think that's kind of a really, and I didn't even know there was a term for those sort of people. Multi-potentialites or scanners are two of the ones I've heard quite often. People who are sort of naturally generalists and who are often kind of mixing different things from different parts of their background or different fields of knowledge, that sort of thing. And I think in innovation, that's a really interesting way to do things, particularly when people are looking for sort of solutions that are really, they're not sort of incremental change or incremental innovations. They're looking to do something significantly different. And that's when kind of cross-pollination can really be of value.
So are you aiming to have the people who come on to your podcast show actually end up maybe collaborating at some level in the future as well? Is it another goal of the show?
Some of them have been collaborators in the past. I think often when you're starting out, your friends and colleagues are often kind of your guinea pig guests if they're nice enough to do that. So they're definitely people who've been collaborators in the past. I think something that has started to happen more usefully now is that the show has been going for about a year and a half now, and it's gotten to a point where I've been able to introduce guests to each other, where that's been useful to them. And, from that point of view, I think it's really useful. From the audience point of view, what I hope they get out of it is, I hope they're somewhat entertained listening to it, but I also hope that they find something useful in it that they can, take into their working lives or into their careers.
Why did you choose the podcast as a medium to get the message out there and to share these stories from these people rather than maybe doing YouTube videos or something like that?
Yeah. I think podcasting is a really kind of, people talk about how it's a way to kind of really be inside people's ears, maybe in a closer way than sort of watching people on a screen. And I found that pretty interesting. And so that was kind of maybe the major way that I thought this was a good idea to get across.
So you've been going in a year and a half now, and what are some of the major lessons you've learned as a podcaster along the way?
I'm pretty sure I've made every mistake in the book.
as we all do.
Absolutely. As with a lot of things innovative, you learn partly through making mistakes. So yeah, I think some of the things that I've learned are, just kind of establishing the process for it. And I know you have this as well, kind of, you prep the guests really well, and that's when you're most likely to get kind of interesting conversation out of it. I also try to choose the guests well, in the sense that, usually I've done a bit of background research on them if they have kind of other recordings out there or they've got blog posts or LinkedIn or something else. So, I try to prepare myself. That was definitely a good learning in terms of knowing who I'm talking to and where the conversation could go. Often, as you were saying, you find somebody with a really interesting background, and there's a lot of different directions that conversation can take. And it's actually one of the things that I think I've learned as well is to kind of focus that conversation, because you could actually be talking for a couple of hours. There's some really interesting things that emerge from those chats.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing that I've found, because I've actually been asking my audience for feedback in terms of some of the, I guess, more standard elements of a podcast production, such as how long do you think each episode should be? Do you get bored after 45 minutes, an hour and a half, whatever? And there seems to be a general consensus out there that, if it's interesting, I'll listen to it for whatever period of time, and as we know, there's some pretty good podcast shows out there that go on for 2 hours an episode. So I don't think there is any real benchmark in terms of, it comes down to the individual and what their ability, I guess, to have that conversation that means something to somebody.
For sure. I was really surprised by that myself. My podcast is generally around half an hour, sometimes slightly more, slightly less. And that has to do partly with just my own capacity for editing. I mean, it does, sometimes take quite a while to edit those episodes. But I've also had friends say to me, I listen to this in the car when I'm commuting.
Yes.
And, I'd actually like to listen to something longer because my drive is longer.
There you go. Yeah. So your audience is giving you that feedback as well, which is tremendous. So do you do everything yourself in terms of you search for your guest, you do the production, you do the editing, you do the distribution of your podcast, you're managing the whole thing?
I do most of that right now. I don't know that it will always stay that way. But yeah, and my show is also kind of produced with a sort of a narrative. It is a conversation, but there's a bit of narrative in between kind of the guests' segments. And so it takes a bit longer for me to produce that. And that's kind of where I think I'm a little more involved in the editing process. I also belong to a podcast network, which is a regional podcast network, the Alberta Podcast Network. And so they also are very, very helpful with the distribution.
How does that work actually? How do they help with distribution?
Well, they have a network with a number of different podcasts, and so they also kind of have a platform. They appear, they have media appearances, that sort of thing, events, newsletters, all that kind of stuff. And so, we're often kind of retweeting and helping to publicize each other's stuff, and the network does that as well.
Great. So podcasting is a big thing in Canada?
It is and it isn't. I have heard just anecdotally that, and also maybe from talking to people, I was kind of surprised when I started, and even once I got into it for quite a while. I think it's probably not as big as maybe in some places, like it's definitely not as big as in the US and not as much as in the UK. I don't know how it is in Australia, but there's lots of popular podcasts, but it's kind of unusual to find podcasters who say managed to make this their full-time gig if that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
Whereas I think in other places that might be more common.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think there's certain countries that are, embracing it in a way where they're actually putting together networks and communities which are looking at enhancing income possibilities for podcasters, which I think is really exciting because it's like anything in, you'll know this, yet the amount of time that you put in to actually produce a show is, beyond what people probably even imagine. So I think for people that are doing this full time and putting out good content there, like anything else, they should be getting some kind of financial reward for it.
For sure. And as you've seen, there's people working on a lot of different business models around this.
Now, getting back to your bio for a second, and this might be an interesting segue, but unusual jobs. Some would say that podcasting is an unusual job if you want to take that on, but investigating the relative sexiness of flies, that's something really out there, isn't it? So
Oh yeah. Yeah, that was I think what part of what led me to realize that, although I'd done my first degree in science, that was not where I was going to work for my full career. So I had a summer job when I was an undergrad student. I was almost in my last year, and I was really lucky to get sort of an exchange job with a research center in Finland. And so I went over there during the summer, and I worked with a number of different research scientists who were working out of this facility, and one of them was an entomologist. And so she was working on a number of different projects, and she was really dedicated. I think she was also kind of what helped point me in the direction to something else eventually, because she was so dedicated. I recall her telling me a story about how when she was doing her doctorate, she'd done it, I think, somewhere like Brazil, and there was a certain type of insect, I think a certain type of fly, that lays its eggs under the skin of mammals. And typically they're animals, but in this case, it had laid its eggs underneath her scalp. And, most people, I know someone else that happened to, and, he went to a doctor, had it treated, had it removed. She was so fascinated by this whole process. She allowed it to just continue and let the larva hatch in her scalp. And I was both fascinated and kind of horrified. And I kind of thought, I don't know if I'm ever going to be this dedicated. I don't know if I'm not necessarily cut out to be a scientist.
That's taking science to a whole new level. And
for sure.
I dare say, with the way you just described that, we probably lost 20% of my listeners, actually, when you started.
I hope not.
But I just wanted to throw in there about Finland. Isn't it an amazing country? The country of lakes, and it's such a beautiful place, particularly in the summertime. Did you get to go around and enjoy a bit of time around Finland?
I did. And, my employers were generous and happy to kind of have me spend some time sort of discovering their country as well. And as you said, it's beautiful. Yeah. It was also really interesting for me because, in terms of the landscape, it's very much like the part of Canada where I grew up. And so, if you close your eyes and you change the language and you just look around, you could almost be looking at sort of some really identical scenery.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was wonderful. It was one of the best summers I think I had.
Now, like a lot of countries that people will go and visit, it's all about what's happening away from the city. So yes, Helsinki's there and it's a nice place and you get to look around, but get out of there and get into the countryside, because the scenery, the beautiful nature and all the different things that Finland has to offer is a tremendous thing. I've actually got some friends who are over there about to start an RV trip through Finland in the middle of winter, which I thought was quite fascinating. So
oh,
we'll
wow.
see.
Good for them.
We'll see how that goes. But that's another good way of having a segue into some crazy things that you've done in your life. So when we're talking about the middle of winter, getting outdoors and doing stuff when people are normally wrapped up inside keeping warm, you decide to go and do things like canoe across the Arctic Circle. So obviously you did that in summertime, did you? Or when did you do that?
That was in Finland and it was in the summer. So yeah, absolutely.
So what brought that about? Tell us the story behind that.
I think that was, I had a couple of weeks off from that summer job, and it really was an opportunity to kind of see a bit of the country. And the place where I was based, the research center, was actually, in a very small village. So I wasn't necessarily based in a major city, but I had an opportunity to kind of get up to Rovaniemi, which is close to the Arctic Circle. Up, yeah. And, I was with a couple of friends, and we rented a canoe. We did some camping, very similar, again, to what I would have done at home in Ontario. And we kind of canoed across the Arctic Circle, which it's much harder to do here in Canada. But in Finland, it's a smaller country, and it's also, it's not tundra at the tree line. It's still forest at the tree line, so it's very doable. And it was fantastic. It was a lot of fun. Midnight sun that time of year. Yeah. Also a lot of mosquitoes.
Right.
But it's great. I really enjoyed it, and I still have some good friends there, so really good memories of that time.
Is it something, once you've done it, you kind of think, well, I'd really love to go back and explore more of that? Or is it just something that you say, well, I've ticked that off my bucket list? Well, maybe it wasn't even on the bucket list, but maybe it's just something that's a one-off and you've done it. Because one of the things that fascinates me talking to people about travel is the places that they love so much that they want to go back to. Is that one of the places you'd like to go back to?
Oh, for sure. I've been back, to visit, and definitely, it's somewhere that I'm always happy. I'd be happy to visit again.
Yeah, and what about other places? Have you been? I'm really interested to know. Have you been back to the Netherlands and Botswana and those places to visit now that you're an adult versus when you were a child and you did those first trips?
Yeah, I have, and it's an interesting experience. I have friends in most of those places, and so I've been really fortunate. I think it makes a lot of difference when you travel if you know people who are there, whether they're locals or they're from somewhere else. You kind of get a bit of a window into other people's lives, and what it's actually like to live in that place, which is sort of different than if you're a tourist or you're passing through. And it's really kind of a privilege, I think, to be able to do that. And so I have been back to a few of the countries where I lived as a kid, and it's really interesting. I mean, everything shrinks.
Yeah.
It's like when you're looking at a doll's house as a kid, and all of a sudden you look at it as an adult.
You're a big person now.
Impression. For sure. Yeah, it's a whole different thing. You see it with different eyes.
So what would you say is the most fascinating place that you've traveled to so far in your life?
I think probably one of the most interesting experiences that I had in my mid-20s, I worked in China for about a year, and that was really interesting.
Whereabouts in China?
I worked in Wuhan, which is in central China. Yep. And I think it was interesting partly because at the time, and it's been, I haven't managed to get back there, there weren't a ton of people who spoke English. So it really was kind of an immersion experience. And I I didn't know that I was going until, very shortly before I left. And so I didn't necessarily have time to give myself a crash course in Chinese before I got there. But I started doing that, as soon as I got there, because, there was virtually nothing I could do and hardly anyone that I could speak to unless I learned the language really quickly. And so, full on immersion and really fascinating, amazing food.
Yep.
And again, really warm, welcoming, a lot of great people.
And very different going into central China than going to the established cities on the east coast of China as well. So did you find that also a very different experience?
Yeah. I visited some of the eastern cities to travel through, and it is different. They have a different feel. I think each of the cities, big cities, has a different feel to it. Some of the parts that I found most interesting, actually, maybe because it was completely new to me, were some of the cities sort of around Inner Mongolia, which is closer maybe to Central Asia, or it has a closer feel to Central Asia, and that was really interesting. The food, the culture, the landscape, all very different.
You're a very multi-dimensional person. So when you travel, do you have your kind of business hat on, your scientific hat on, your political hat on? Do you look at a place through all those different dimensions?
I think for a lot of us, those things all start to bump into each other after a while, right? One thing I do find is kind of useful, and I don't know if you find this or any of your other guests, I'd be interested to know, is that I think, especially if you've been lucky enough to have an opportunity to visit a lot of places, it helps you understand places that you go to that you haven't been to before. There might be a bit of a template. I've seen this kind of pattern before. I've seen what this looks like before. I know how this works. And then you kind of test that reality against the way you think it works, and then you start to kind of figure out what you're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, are you a person that prefers to travel alone, or do you like to travel with other people?
A bit of both, actually. I think a lot of the early traveling that I did, first, obviously, when I was a child, it was with family. Later on, it was a lot on my own, and then other times it's been with friends and, with my husband as well. So it's been a bit of a mixture, and I find it, that's always an interesting experience, too, because, when you're traveling with other people, sometimes you end up seeing things that you wouldn't necessarily choose to see on your own, or you wouldn't think of, and that gives you a whole other look into the country. Sometimes it's just nice to go on your own because you get to be kind of, to be honest, selfish and do whatever you want and see whatever you want.
Yeah, and it's what I find really fascinating is when you go to a place and you have both of those experiences. So the first time you may go and you go there solo, and then second time you go back with somebody else or a group of people. And you're right in what you said earlier in the show about, it really determines the outcome of the experience you have, and it can be quite different just by the fact that you were alone or you were with other people.
Yeah, for sure. That absolutely changes things. There's a couple of places that I've been to that, are like that. And again, completely different experience.
Couple of quick quiz questions for you that I usually throw at my guests halfway through the show. What's your favorite snack food when you're traveling?
Oh, wow. Cheese is a favorite food, so I love sampling cheese wherever I go.
Any particular type of cheese that you prefer?
Sharp cheeses are always good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily, I have to say, having, if you've ever been to France and you kind of see some of the really furry kind of soft cheeses, they're beautiful, but I'm not sure I've fully acquired it.
They're not for you.
For all of them.
Good diplomatic answer, I must say.
I'm still working on that, acquiring the taste buds.
What's the first thing you pack in your suitcase when you go traveling?
A camera.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And the charger.
Yes, definitely. Chargers, absolutely everywhere.
I like to be that guy that's got that shop where everybody turns up and says, I left my charger at home. I need to buy another one when I arrive at my destination, because it seems to happen all the time.
Well, that always sometimes leads to interesting adventures too.
It does,
right?
indeed, yeah. Window or aisle seat when you're on a plane?
Window for sure.
Why is that?
One, if there's something to look at, you can look outside. And number two, you can lean against it and fall asleep a little more comfortably.
Yeah, absolutely. So outdoor sports and activities in the wild, what are some of the things that you get up to there?
Oh, wow. Well, again, I'm lucky to live somewhere right now where there is no end of opportunities for outdoor sports. So, winter, I grew up cross-country skiing. That's always good.
Yeah.
I learned to downhill ski when I first moved to the Rockies, and then I kind of got into backcountry skiing and touring, which has been really, really fun. Yeah, challenging to learn, but you get to some really beautiful places, completely outside of ski resorts that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. I'm keen on mountain biking and rock climbing as well. Also, things that, places that you wouldn't necessarily get to, in a car. But, again, it kind of comes back to that thing that people often ask is, why would you want to do these? These things look like they take a lot of effort and they look kind of painful.
There lies the enjoyment in itself, doesn't it?
Type 2 fun.
That's exactly what it's all about. Now, for people listening to my show today who have got Canada on their bucket list and they want to come over and see your beautiful country, what are your top 3 tips in terms of where they should go and visit in Canada that are maybe off the beaten track a little bit?
Oh, wow. Let's see. Definitely, I think the big city experience is a good one to have. Montreal, I think, Montreal is pretty well known, but it's a fantastic city. When I was in my teens, everybody wanted to go there because it was kind of the party city of Canada. Number 2, I think the north is pretty fantastic. It's harder to get up there. It's not always that cheap, but there's some amazing places, and you'll see things in the north and meet people that you wouldn't necessarily see anywhere else. Yellowknife is kind of the informal capital of Aurora Borealis, Northern Lights, and I keep seeing some really spectacular pictures out of there at the moment.
Because this is the time of the year, isn't it, for the Northern Lights?
It is, yeah. I mean, sometimes you can't see them much further south. I have seen them further south. Recently, we've had a lot of cloud coverage, but consistent, really good photos out of the Yellowknife area.
And what's the best time of the year to visit Canada in your eyes?
I think any time of year is pretty good. I would say maybe not spring. Spring is the season when, a lot of the trees still don't have any leaves, and sometimes it can look a bit bare and muddy. But if you're a warm weather person, summer, fantastic time to visit. Fall, autumn, also good time to visit. It's not too cold. If you visit the east, there's tons of, those beautiful yellow, orange, red trees. And winter is pretty spectacular too. If, you want to see snow and, do all that sort of snow sports and, all those kind of cozy things in front of a fireplace, you can't beat that in winter.
Is Canada always going to be home for you?
I think it will always be home base. I don't know that I will always live here permanently. I'm always open to seeing, what's on the other side. The grass is always, I wouldn't say greener somewhere else, but it's always really interesting somewhere else. And there's a lot of interesting things happening in the world that, I'm interested to take a look at and experience.
What star sign are you? There you go.
Sagittarius.
It's amazing. I ask most people on my show, either when I'm recording it or before or after, and I'd say 75 to 80% of people are Sagittarians that travel like crazy all the time. It's amazing. Yeah.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
No,
Are you a Sagittarius
I'm an
as
Aquarius, which is almost as bad. So we can't sit still either. But Sagittarians, it's just a plethora of guests have been Sagittarians. And that's why I love this show so much because, and you probably get the same thing on your show with people, their backgrounds, their dreams, their goals, their inspirations, and it doesn't matter how much you've traveled in your own life, listening to somebody else's travel goals or experiences is just really fascinating, I find.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. Lots of different people doing lots of different things that, I've never known existed, let alone would have, had any idea they could be done.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question that you might be able to resonate with because it was on your most recent podcast show. If there is one thing you could do for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Oh, wow. Yeah. And, I think I might have the same answer as my guest, maybe not quite in the same way. His answer was that, he would travel for the rest of his life and explore the world in the most unconventional way possible. I would say mine would be, traveling as well, sampling food, I think, and maybe combine that with traveling, a little cross-pollination there. If I could do that for the rest of my life, preferably without food poisoning, that would be near the top of my list.
So what's your favourite food around the world in all your travels? Where have you, I guess, resonated most with particular cuisine?
Oh, wow. When I worked in China, in Wuhan, the food in that region is very, very spicy. And it was, it took a while to get used to it, but it was fantastic. And there was such a variety of food. I think just working in China and, the cuisine is different all over. It's not just kind of one type of cuisine. It's, I've really come to appreciate Chinese cuisine. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it is cool. Just getting back to that question that I just asked you, because I find it really fascinating. And when I came across it on your most recent podcast show, I thought, wow, to wake up every day and ask yourself that question, and then the second part of the question, which is, why aren't I doing it? I think is another fascinating way of looking at it from a philosophical point of view, because we tend to put up excuses and reasons why we can't do stuff in life, but really, like your guest is doing and has done, there's nothing stopping us really to get out there and do it, is there?
There is and there isn't. I think, my guest has also made a lot of sacrifices to do that. I mean, he gave up a conventional career and, he talked about, having given up kind of a conventional life with a job and a pension and a 9-to-5 kind of thing. So, I think if you're willing to do those sorts of things, definitely. I don't know that I've necessarily given it up. There are times when I've put it on hold. I think there were definitely times when I was an adult and I'd spent quite a few years traveling. And at a certain point, I just, I wanted to come home for a while. And I just wanted to be back in my hometown. And I knew it wasn't necessarily going to be forever. It was sort of a stop along the way.
Do you think that's something that's you're born with, or do you think it's something that evolves as you as a person as you go through life in terms of having that ability to be able to step away and completely change your life?
I think, for some of us, you're almost born into it, maybe especially people like me who had that experience growing up as a child, and you sort of become very accustomed to doing that. It's a very comfortable thing. I think for me, I think it's a strange experience for some people, but it's a very comfortable experience for me to kind of uproot and move somewhere else. And kind of settle in somewhere else, start putting down roots, start meeting people, start, finding your way around, kind of a new city, a new town, all that sort of thing. There's no doubt that it's really rewarding. It can also be really challenging. It can be quite exhausting in the period when you're trying to get used to it, especially if you're adapting to a whole new language and a new culture and all that sort of thing. I think some people, if they come to it later on in life, they really love it and they realize that, this is really what they want to do. And for other people, it doesn't draw them that much. They might be happy to go on vacations periodically, but it's not necessarily a really important thing for them.
Do you think a lot of people leave traveling too late in life?
Yeah, I've heard people say that, and it's interesting because I think I've heard a few friends say that they had all sorts of plans for things that they wanted to do, and maybe they were going to do them later on when their kids were a certain age, or even when they retired way further on, and then at some point something happened in their lives, or they watched something happen to someone else, maybe someone's life cut short in a certain way, and they kind of realized that there's now, and now is the time to do it. And it's been really interesting watching other people kind of really grab onto that and just kind of go for it.
Well, one last question before I let you go today, and that question is, how has all of your travel experiences combined changed your view or created the view that you have today on the world that we live in?
I think it's had a really strong impact on me. I mean, it kind of permeates, I think, the way that I see everything. I think that, one of the ways that it has really stamped me is how many friends, and maybe even half or more than half of my friends, are people who either, have spent significant time living outside their own country. So they're able to shift between perspectives. They're able to see kind of that there's more than one way to live. There isn't necessarily, one right culture, one right food, one right way to do things. There's a lot of kind of multiplicity in kind of traveling and adapting to different things. It's, I think there's a reason I married someone who, immigrated from another country. That's probably has a lot to do with my upbringing as well, and kind of wanting to have that international exposure and, my friends and colleagues and my work as well as kind of in my personal life.
I lied. I'm going to ask you another question now. That wasn't the last one. So my last question is travel all that it's cracked up to be?
in the sense of, is it a fantastic time every time?
Yeah.
I think it's if it's a wonderful time every time, you're either really lucky or you're doing something wrong. or maybe it's just the way that I've experienced it. I think travel has been, the most fantastic experience in the sense that I have learned more from traveling and seeing and working in other places than I have from doing almost anything else. At the same time, It's given me some of the most challenging experiences that I've ever had. And some of them I was happy to have once and be done with them after that. So there's both sides, definitely.
Nbee, listen, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on my show today. Crosspollination is the name of your podcast, and I'm going to put all the details on where my listeners can find that in the show notes today, so they can come on and listen to your amazing episodes and all the interesting people you've had on your show, and also get in touch with you if they want to find out a little bit more about what you do, where you're going, and whether they can collaborate with you in any way.
Absolutely, that would be fantastic. Thanks so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure being on your show.
And I really hope the podcats really like the show as well, and they get to sit down and listen to it with their mother later on today sometime.
I will make sure they do.
Well, I'd love to have you back on the show at some stage, so we'll keep in touch and see whether we can make that happen down the track. But thanks very much for coming on the Global Travel Channel podcast show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark.
So that was Nbee talking to me from Alberta in Canada. Such a beautiful country. If you haven't been there, book a ticket, get over to Canada. Check out its amazing scenery across the entire country, and it's got some pretty cool cities, as she mentioned as well. Get to Montreal and check it all out. So if you want to check out Nbee's podcast show, I'll put in the show notes the link to her show called Crosspollination. She's got some really interesting guests on her show, so head on over there and check it out. As for this particular episode, this was the first episode I've done with a guest host. My guest host today was Natalie Thomas, doing the introduction for the show. Natalie's been on my show as a guest a number of times and is a great collaborator in the travel blogging space, but also very focused on mindfulness, meditation, and some other well-being practices. So check out Natalie's contacts as well, that I also put in the show notes today. Well, if you're looking for more episodes from the Global Travel Channel podcast show, head on over to the website at www.globaltravelchannel.com. You'll find all of our previous episodes there. The great news is you can download them also from places like iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and a host of other locations which are all listed there on our website. So download them, listen to them in your own free time. I recommend you listen to a podcast on the way to work in the morning. It's a great way to start the day by listening to someone's inspirational travel stories. And please tell someone about our show. So a friend, a family member, or even a work colleague, tell them about the Global Travel Channel podcast show. We're trying to grow our show across the world as far as listeners go, so anybody new coming to the show to listen will be muchly appreciated. Okay, that's it for me for this time in this particular episode. My name is Mark Philpott, and until we meet again, I wish you all a happy and safe bon voyage.